Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to uncover the deep literary architecture behind a truly massive modern reading movement. If you've glanced at a bestseller list or hung out in any online reading communities lately, you've probably noticed an absolute explosion in the appetite for fantasy fiction. But we aren't just talking about any fantasy here. We're talking about a very specific shift in how stories are told and exactly who gets to be at the center of them. So let's track this journey from the rigid, traditional quests of the past to the absolute boom of modern romantasy we're seeing today.
Okay, get this. 114. That is the exact number of fantasy books a Reddit user going by Goldfishy read in just a few short months, dating back to October. I mean, that is basically a book a day. Talk about a superhuman level of dedication, right? They posted this wild number to the r/romantasy subreddit because they were burning through material so fast they were desperately looking for their next read. And the crazy thing is, they are definitely not alone. The comment section on that post was just flooded with readers who've consumed a similar amount, eagerly swapping these massive, seemingly endless reading lists. This voracious reading appetite is being fueled by massive, predominantly female-led series that are just constantly recommended across Reddit. We're talking about heavy hitters here. Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses, Zodiac Academy, and Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Wing. The sheer volume of engagement around these books is honestly phenomenal. But to understand exactly why this specific subgenre, what a lot of people dub romantasy, is exploding right now, and why readers literally cannot get enough of it, we kind of have to zoom out and look at the foundation of fantasy literature itself. What we are really looking at here is a massive paradigm shift. Today's romantasty explosion is super female-centered. It features complex, magical women with total narrative agency, and it's driving these massive online fandoms. But historically, traditional epic fantasy was heavily male-dominated. It relied on rigid, patriarchal quest structures where women were often sidelined. They were just mere prizes or, at best, helpful sidekicks. So how on earth did we get from the historical constraints of traditional epic fantasy to this modern boom?
Well, to make sense of this evolution, our explainer today is broken into 5 quick parts. 1. The romantasy reading boom. 2. The Tolkien fantasy formula. 3. The magical woman problem. 4. Breaking the quest narrative. And 5. The future of fantasy. Let's get right into it.
Part 2. The Tolkien fantasy formula. The roots of epic fantasy.
To really grasp the rules modern authors are breaking, we first have to understand who wrote them. To ground us, we're pulling from a genuinely fascinating 2018 academic dissertation by Kimberly Wickham from the University of Rhode Island. Wickham defines traditional epic fantasy as a tale written on a grand scale, dealing with the founding or defense of a land. Crucially, it takes place in a completely separate, secondary world, meaning a world that is not and ever was Earth. Throw in some incredibly high stakes, significant magical elements, and a protagonist overcoming impossible hurdles, and you've got yourself an epic fantasy. Now, Tolkien famously utilized the classic monomyth. You might know this better as the hero's journey, a concept popularized by Joseph Campbell. And it is a highly standardized path. Step 1, a young, almost always male orphan leaves his quiet village. Step 2, he ventures out into a region of supernatural wonder and faces trials. Step 3, he defeats some great evil force. And Step 4, he returns home to restore the land. It's an incredibly effective narrative loop for sure, but man, it is heavily focused on a young male's experience of the world. We can trace exactly how this specific formula became the absolute industry standard. Tolkien essentially established the genre in the 1950s, but it was really in the 1970s and 80s that publishers realized just how wildly profitable this structure was. Suddenly, we saw this flood of what critics call formulaic Tolkien copycats, like Terry Brooks' The Sword of Shannara or David Eddings' The Belgariad. These books cemented the male-centric quest as the expected, highly marketable structure for literally decades. Even as things got grittier and way more complex than the 90s, that core structure, it remained largely intact.
Which brings us to part 3, the magical woman problem, power versus patriarchal containment.
So what happens when you introduce powerful, magical women into these traditional, heavily male-dominated quest structures? Well, you run into some really fascinating narrative tension. The crucial point here, drawn straight from Wickham's academic analysis, is that in the rules of fantasy, magic inherently equals power. It is an elemental force that gives a character the literal ability to shape the world. Therefore, a woman wielding profound magical power acts as a direct threat to the underlying patriarchal narrative structures that early fantasy relied on. Think about it. If she has the power to change the world, why on earth is she just following the farm boy around? Historically, authors really had to figure out what to do with this perceived threat, and they typically neutralized it through narrative containment. They would write these amazing women who possessed incredible elemental power, healing abilities, and world-changing magic, but then they would constrain them. They'd subsume these powerful women into messy love triangles, completely diminish their agency, or just sideline them as mere helpers, guides, or romantic prizes for the male hero, rather than letting them actually drive the plot forward themselves. A perfect, highly visible example of this, cited in the source material, is the character of Toriel, from Peter Jackson's 2013 cinematic adaptation of The Hobbit. When Toriel is introduced, she is this fiercely capable, magical elven fighter with a really strong moral compass. Yet because she's inserted into a narrative that insists on maintaining a strict patriarchal structure, she ends up sidelined. She becomes the prize in a love triangle, she gets rescued by Legolas, and she literally ends the films crying over a male character. Her power is totally subsumed by the narrative's need to elevate the guys. Let's move on to part 4. Breaking the quest narrative, reimagining the conventions of genre. Thankfully for all of us, readers evolved, and fans started demanding some fresh stories. Modern authors realized that to give female characters true narrative agency, they couldn't just write quote-unquote stronger women. They actually had to break the rigid molds of the genre itself. Wickham's research points out a profound truth about storytelling here. You cannot simply drop a female character into a male slot and call it a day. The actual underlying narrative architecture must change. The quest itself, the way the world is built, the way power is distributed, all of these structural elements have to be modified or just discarded entirely if a magical woman is going to avoid being trapped by those old tropes. We can see this solution beautifully in action with authors like Lois McMaster-Bujold. Instead of the traditional quest featuring some young, naive orphan boy, her acclaimed novel Paladin of Souls features Royana Esta, who is a 40-year-old widow and mother. By fundamentally changing who gets to be the hero, Bujold completely alters the nature of the quest narrative. Her magical woman isn't a sidekick waiting in the wings. She is a fully realized hero in her own right, dealing with uniquely female experiences of the world. And other brilliant authors have taken this structural modification even further. Modern fantasy is actively discarding that simplistic good versus evil binary. Authors are utilizing egalitarian world building where magic grants power totally regardless of gender. They're using multiple narrators instead of leaning on a single chosen one. The source material heavily highlights N.K. Jemisin, for example, whose Inheritance trilogy completely throws out the traditional quest to focus on marginalized post-colonial perspectives. We're talking about a protagonist who is a poor, blind woman wielding immense magic. It's an absolute reimagining of what fantasy can be. And that leads us nicely into our final section, Part 5, The Future of Fantasy, Bridging Fandom and Academic Critique. So let's connect all this deep literary theory right back to those massive, hungry, online reading communities we saw at the very beginning of this explainer. This brings us directly to answering our initial question of why this is happening now. In traditional epic fantasy, romance was just a side plot, a reward for the male hero. Today, it's a central, driving narrative force. The protagonist has shifted from the young male orphan to complex, powerful female leads with total agency. And magic is no longer just a cool plot device for battles, it's a vital tool for empowerment. We can see exactly why Reddit users are happily reading hundreds of these books. Modern romantasy offers the epic scale, the complex magic, and the deep romance that readers crave, but entirely without sacrificing female empowerment to old patriarchal structures. It's a completely new, incredibly addictive reading experience. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. Storytelling structures absolutely matter. They subtly tell us who gets to hold power and who gets to make the choices that matter. So the next time you pick up a fantasy book or binge an entire massive new romantasy series over a weekend, ask yourself, whose narrative rules are you really reading? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep exploring out there.